Hi everyone, this is Kristen McCarty and I'm giving my presentation on Carl Rogers today. Carl Rogers was an influential American psychologist who, along with Abraham Maslow, was the founder of the humanist approach to clinical psychology. Carl Rogers proposed that therapy could be simpler, warmer, and more optimistic than that carried out by behavioral or psychodynamic psychologists. Rogers was notorious for his level of empathy with others. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1902. His father was a civil engineer and his mother was a housewife and devout Christian. Rogers was educated in a strict religious and ethical environment. He became a rather isolated, independent, and very disciplined child at a very young age. After graduation, he married and moved to New York City and began attending the Union Theological Seminary. It's a famous liberal religious institution. Rogers then attended Columbia University's clinical psychology program and graduated with his PhD in 1931. In 1942, he wrote his first book, Counseling and Psychotherapy. In it, Rogers suggested that the client, by establishing a relationship with an understanding, accepting therapist, can resolve difficulties and gain the insight necessary to restructure their life. In 1951, he published his major work, Client-Centered Therapy, wherein he outlines his basic theory. In 1964, he was selected as Humanist of the Year by the American Humanist Association. In 1987, unfortunately, Rogers suffered a fall that resulted in a fractured hip. He had a successful operation, but his heart failed the next night, and he died unexpectedly a few days later, which was very unfortunate. I'm now going to break down his theory just a little bit better. It's also referred to in modern times as Rogerian theory. His views differ sharply from the psychodynamic and behavioral approaches, in that he suggested that clients would be better helped if they were encouraged to focus on their current subjective understanding rather than on some unconscious motive or someone else's interpretation of the situation. Rogers' theory is a clinical one based on years of experience dealing with his clients. The theory is considered to be humanistic, not phenomenological, believing strongly that the theory could come out of practice rather than the other way around. Rogers developed his theory based on his work with emotionally troubled people and claimed that we have a remarkable capacity for self-healing and personal growth, leading towards self-actualization. He placed emphasis on a person's current perception and how we live in the here and now. His theory is based on 19 propositions. Instead of going through each proposition one by one, which would probably take quite a bit of time, I've included them with the posting of this video in the discussion board. One of the propositions that I thought really stood out as monumental was the second proposition, which states, the organism reacts to the field as it is experienced and perceived. This perceptual field is reality for the individual. And this basically just means that our sense of reality is completely unique to ourselves, is formed out of what we individually experienced and how I personally process to understand my experience, which basically could be called my story or stories. Rogers' 19 propositions cover a multitude of areas, and I feel that they're a very comprehensive tool for us to better understand the humanistic approach. Carl Rogers is best known for his contributions to therapy. His therapy has gone through a couple of different name changes along the way. He originally called it non-directive because he felt that the therapist should not lead the client, but rather be there for the client while the client directs the progress of therapy. As he became more experienced, he realized that as non-directive as he was, he still had influence on his clients by his very non-directiveness. In other words, his clients took to therapists for guidance and will find it even when the therapist is trying not to guide. He then changed the name to client-centered. He still felt that the client was the one who would say what is wrong, find their ways of improving, and determine the conclusion of the therapy, but his therapy was still very client-centered, even while he acknowledged the impact of the therapist. One major difference between humanistic counselors and other therapists is that they refer to those in therapy as clients, not patients. This is because they see the therapist and client as equal partners rather than as an expert treating a client. The terms non-directive and client-centered are still used today, but most people just call it Rogerian therapy. I personally really love how Rogers gives real-world examples to demonstrate how his therapy works with clients. One of the phrases that Rogers used to describe his therapy is supportive, not reconstructive. And he used the analogy of learning to ride a bicycle to really explain this, and I really like it. He said, when you help a child to learn to ride a bike, you can't just tell them how. They have to try it for themselves. And you can't hold them up the whole time either. There comes a point when you have to let them go. If they fall, they fall. But if you hang on, they never learn. It's the same in therapy. If independence is what you are helping a client to achieve, then they will not achieve that if they remain dependent on you, the therapist. They need to try their insights on their own, in the real life beyond the therapist's office. An authoritarian approach to therapy may seem to work marvelously at first, but ultimately it only creates a dependent person. There is one technique that Rogerian therapists are particularly known for, and it's reflection. Reflection is the mirroring of emotional communication. If the client says, I feel horrible, the therapist may reflect this back to the client by saying something like, so, life's getting you down, hey? By doing this, the therapist is communicating to the client that he is indeed listening and cares enough to understand. The therapist is also letting the client know what the client is communicating. Often people in distress say things that they don't mean because it feels good to say them. So reflection must be used carefully and it must be used genuinely, but it's really a great technique that they use in Rogerian therapy. There's almost total absence of techniques in Rogerian psychotherapy due to the unique character of each counseling relationship. Of utmost importance, however, is the quality of the relationship between the client and the therapist. So basically, if there are any techniques, they are listening, they're accepting, they're understanding, sharing, which seem like more attitude-oriented than skills-oriented, but they're actually skills that you're using in Rogerian therapy. Rogers was once quoted as saying, the therapeutic relationship is the critical variable, not what the therapist says or does. All of this brings us to Rogers' famous requirements of the therapist. Rogers felt that a therapist, in order to be effective, must have 3 very special qualities. The first quality is congruence, which is basically being genuine, having honesty with your client, and this can be displayed by not just agreeing. The second quality is empathy, and it's the ability to feel what the client feels. This refers to a therapist's ability to understand sensitively and accurately the client's experience and feelings in the here and now. The third quality is respect or acceptance. Rogers believed that for people to grow and fulfill their potential, it is important that they are valued as themselves. He says these qualities are necessary and sufficient. If the therapist shows these 3 qualities, the client will improve, even if no other special techniques are used. If the therapist does not show these 3 qualities, the client's improvement will be minimal, no matter how many techniques are used. I was personally inspired in learning this because I someday hope that I can manifest all of these qualities in my personal therapy practice. I greatly hope that you enjoyed my presentation on Carl Rogers and picked up some valuable information about the client-centered approach to therapy. Throughout this presentation, I used the article. It was called I'd Come to You for Therapy, Interpretation, Redefinition, and Paradox in Rogerian Therapy, and it was authored by Senta Tromel Plotz. It's from the 17th volume of the Journal of Psychotherapy, Theory, Research, and Practice. It was published in the fall of 1980. And I also used the website provided by Dr. Scalin. I hope you enjoyed.